Picture this. You wake up tomorrow and discover that every single person on Earth owes someone money. Your neighbor owes you. You owe your friend owes your neighbor. Everyone's in debt, everyone's a creditor, and the numbers just keep climbing. Sound absurd? Welcome to the global economy. The world is drowning in $315 trillion of debt. That's not a typo. $315 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's more than 3 times what the entire global economy produces in a year. The United States alone carries $37 trillion in debt, and that number ticks up by millions every single day. But here's the question that should keep you up at night. If every nation is drowning in debt, who's actually holding all the money? The answer isn't what you think. And once you understand it, you'll never look at money, government spending, or economic news the same way again. Let's start with America, the world's economic superpower and its biggest debtor. When most people hear $37 trillion in debt, they imagine some foreign nation holding all the cards. Maybe China, right? China does own about $750 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. But here's the twist that breaks the narrative. China itself is buried under its own mountain of debt, over $16 trillion in government debt alone. And when you include corporate and household debt, China's total debt exceeds 303% of its GDP. So China lends to America, but China's also borrowing. From whom? Chinese banks, Japanese investors, European pension funds. And those institutions? They're also holding American debt. The web gets stranger. American banks hold Chinese bonds. European banks hold American bonds. Japanese banks hold European bonds. Brazilian pension funds invest in all of them. It's a tangled, infinite loop where everyone owes everyone. And somehow the system keeps spinning. But if everyone owes money, and everyone's also owed money, then where does the actual wealth sit? The uncomfortable truth, nowhere and everywhere. The global debt system doesn't work like your personal credit card. It's not about paying things off. It's about something far more unsettling: perpetual motion. To understand how we got here, we need to go back, way back, to before money even existed. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. Spring arrives, but you've run out of grain to plant. Your neighbor has extra, so you make a deal. Lend me a bag of grain now, and I'll pay you back 2 bags after the harvest. No coins, no banks, no interest rates calculated to the 3rd decimal point. Just a promise, a debt based on trust. For millennia, this is all debt was. Borrowing from tomorrow to survive today. Kings borrowed to build castles. Merchants borrowed to fund voyages. Debt was a tool, not a system. But in the 1600s, something revolutionary happened. England was at war with the Dutch. King Charles II desperately needed money, more money than any single lender could provide. The nobles refused to help. The royal treasury was empty. So England did something radical. They sliced the debt into pieces and sold it to the public. Citizens could buy bonds, written promises from the government that said, "Give us £100 today, and we'll pay you back £110 in a year." It worked. Suddenly, nations could raise enormous sums without emptying their coffers or raising taxes. Thousands of small investors replaced a handful of wealthy nobles. Debt became democratized. By the time World Wars I and II arrived, bonds had gone global. Governments sold war bonds by the billions. Buy a bond, back a soldier, the posters said. And people did millions of ordinary citizens funding wars by lending to their governments. Here's what they didn't realize. They weren't just funding a war. They were building the architecture of the modern economy. Fast forward to 1944. World War II is ending, and world leaders gather in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. to redesign the global financial system. Their solution? Tie every major currency to the US dollar and tie the dollar to gold. It sounded stable. It sounded smart. But there was a problem. Economies needed to grow faster than gold could be mined. By 1971, President Richard Nixon faced a choice: watch the system collapse or cut the cord. On August 15th, Nixon went on television and announced that America would no longer convert dollars to gold. Just like that, money became fiat. From the Latin, let it be done. Money was now backed by nothing but government decree and faith. No gold, no silver, just trust. And that changed everything. Without gold constraining the money supply, governments could borrow almost without limit. Need to build infrastructure, borrow. Economic recession, borrow. Financial crisis, borrow more. By the 1980s, global debt exploded. Countries discovered that debt wasn't just for emergencies, it was rocket fuel for growth. Build a highway today, pay for it over 30 years. Borrow during a recession, and stimulate your way back to growth. The 2008 financial crisis cemented this model. Governments borrowed trillions to bail out banks. The 2020 COVID pandemic, more trillions flooded into the economy through debt-funded stimulus. And it worked. Unemployment fell. Economies recovered. But the debt? It never went away. In fact, from 2020 to 2024 alone, global debt surged by $30 trillion. Today it sits at $315 trillion and climbing. The system had transformed. Debt was no longer a temporary tool. It had become the permanent foundation of modern prosperity. So let's return to our original question. If everyone's in debt, who's holding the money? The answer is both simple and mind-bending. Everyone and no one. Here's how it works. The US government needs to borrow $1 trillion. So the Treasury Department issues bonds, essentially IOUs. Who buys them? American banks, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, foreign governments, the Federal Reserve itself. These institutions buy the bonds, and the government gets cash. But here's where it gets weird. The government pays them interest. Billions of dollars flow from taxpayers to these bondholders every single year. In fact, in 2024, the U.S. spent over $1.1 trillion just on interest payments, more than it spent on national defense or Medicare. So what do the bondholders do with that interest money? They buy more bonds. Think about that. The government borrows, pays interest, and the lenders use that interest to lend even more. It's a perfect circle, or depending on your perspective, a perfect trap. And it's not just America. Japan's retirees save money that funds Dutch infrastructure. Dutch pension funds buy Brazilian bonds. Brazilian banks invest in US treasuries. The debt flows in an infinite loop around the planet. Nobody's hoarding cash in a vault somewhere. The money doesn't exist in any single place. It exists in motion, constantly being borrowed, lent, spent, and reinvested. The system works as long as everyone keeps playing. But what happens if someone stops? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The global economy is like a bicycle. It only stays upright if it keeps moving. When governments borrow and spend, that money circulates. A government builds a bridge, construction workers get paid. They buy groceries, shopkeepers earn income. They order supplies. Manufacturers stay busy. More jobs, more spending, more growth. But if government suddenly stopped borrowing, the money flow would slow. Projects would halt. Businesses would cut back. Workers would lose jobs. And when unemployed workers stop spending, businesses earn even less. It becomes a downward spiral. Economists call this the paradox of thrift. When everyone tries to save at once, the economy contracts and everyone ends up poorer. So governments keep borrowing, not out of recklessness, but out of necessity. The machine must keep running. But here's what haunts every economist, every central banker, every political leader who understands this system. Can it really go on forever? Japan's debt to GDP ratio exceeds 260%. Italy's is over 140%. The US is approaching 130%. These aren't emergency measures anymore. This is the baseline, the new normal. And every few years, we borrow more to pay off the old debt. Refinancing on a planetary scale. What happens when the interest payments become so large, they crowd out everything else? What happens if lenders lose faith? What happens when the music stops? So if every nation is in debt, who's really holding the money? The answer is that money, as we imagine it, as piles of cash sitting somewhere, doesn't really exist. What exists is trust. Trust in governments to honor their promises. Trust in banks to manage the system. Trust in the circular flow to keep spinning. The $315 trillion in global debt isn't wealth that's been lost. It's wealth that will be earned. Or at least that's the promise. Every dollar of debt is a claim on future productivity, future growth, future prosperity. But promises can be broken. The global debt system is the most ambitious experiment in human history, an economic perpetual motion machine that defies every intuition about how money should work. And the terrifying, exhilarating truth is this: we're all part of it. Your savings account, your retirement fund, your government's budget, they're all threads in this massive, interconnected web. The debt isn't someone else's problem. It's the system we've built our entire civilization upon. The question isn't whether it can keep going. The question is, what happens when it doesn't? If this investigation opened your eyes to how money really works, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This is Beyond GDP, where we don't just look at the numbers, we look at the system behind them. Until then, follow the money.